Okay, let's move on to Module 11, Setting Constraints and Deadlines. So this particular module is going to deal with setting constraints within your schedule as well as setting deadlines. So quite often within your schedule there are going to be specific constraints within your schedule where you're going to want to make sure that tasks start on a particular date, right? You're also going to want to set deadlines that allow you as a project manager to see particular um, tasks in your schedule that need to complete on a particular date, and you want some type of indication that that date is approaching, right? Or you've potentially gone past that deadline even earlier on in your schedule, so that you can make some adjustments to make sure that you get to that date on time. So before we get started, let's look at a couple terms here. The very first one is constraint, right? A restriction or limitation that is set on the start or finish date of a particular task. So you can set this by either editing the date in your list of tasks, or you can actually set the constraint by double-clicking on the task, which we'll see here in a little bit. These different constraints are thought of as being either flexible or inflexible. Right, the flexible constraint is something like the as soon as possible, which you're very familiar with. As soon as you create a task, that is the default constraint type. Also, you have inflexible constraints like must finish on, where the task itself will not move once you set a must finish on constraint, for example. It's considered to be inflexible. You also have deadlines, which you can set, which is basically it's a target date, right? When you want a task to be completed, and it will provide you with a little indicator in your timeline to show you that that particular date has a deadline against it. And this allows for the greatest level of flexibility in your schedule, because it will not prevent you from going beyond that date, but it will give you an indicator within your schedule so that you can see that you've gone past that particular date that you've set up as a deadline. So what we'll want to do is make sure that we are in the MPO7 Fund Module 11 MPP file, and we're going to want to make sure that we save that as a different file name, and we'll get started. You should have the Module 11 file open, and the very first thing we'll do is save this as a new file name. Again, I'll simply put the my in front of it. And so in this module we want to be talking about setting up our constraints and also looking at working with deadlines. So the very first thing I'll do is set up a flexible constraint. So in your manual you're noticing that it's having us go to task number 8 by using the F5 key, or just simply clicking on that task, which in this case is conduct needs analysis. So let's look at the current start date of this task. So I'm just going to pull my split bar over just so I can see the start and finish dates. So you're noticing the date there of 1/8/2010 in this particular case. So I can simply double click on this task to take me into the task information dialog box, and then I'm going to go to the advanced tab, and in the advanced tab you'll see that the default constraint type is as soon as possible. So I can change that constraint type, and what I'm going to do here is change it to finish no earlier than, and then I'm going to set the date, which in this case is simply the 11th of January, which is that Monday. Keep in mind what the current date is here, right? Finish no earlier than 1/11/2010, and then I'll simply click OK. And then I'll click away from that so that we can see what it did here from a graphical representation perspective. And you're noticing that if I roll my pointer over that, it tells me that a finish no earlier than constraint has been set up on 1/11. So nothing actually moves within the schedule, but this is a constraint that we've set up so that in this case it's going to finish no earlier than, right, this particular date, right? In this case 1/11. So let's create another one, and let's go to task number 18, which is review preliminary software, and let's double click on that one. And let's set an inflexible constraint for this particular task. So again, you're going to want to make sure that you are in the Advanced tab, and we're going to go to the constraint type, and let's set a must start on constraint for this particular task, and this one will be the 25th of January. So I'll go back again, January 25th, 2010, right, and we'll click OK. And you're noticing that in this case, for this schedule, that it did move us to 125 because we're setting an inflexible constraint that this must start on that particular date. And you can notice that the graphical in the indicators column representation here, it has a little red box there to indicate that it is an inflexible constraint, and that's a visual cue to us to let us know the type of constraint that's been set up on this particular schedule. Now let's set a deadline, and we'll do that to task number 24, which is the design complete, and you can double click on that task. Again, go to the Advanced tab if you're not already there, and notice that above the constraints is the deadline area. So click on that drop down, navigate yourself back to the February time frame, and we'll set this to 2/15/2010 in the deadline, and we'll click OK. Now what I'm going to do is scroll across here so that you can actually see what this did, and you'll notice that right in this particular area is the little arrow pointing down, which is an indication to us that there's been a deadline set on that particular task, and you can actually see it in the timeline.